One misplaced word could decide your fate in the Middle Ages. This was the hidden world of medieval oaths and contracts, where language was a labyrinth of deliberate traps. By the end of this journey, you will possess the skill to spot the hidden escape clauses that shaped history. We will uncover how a king could swear a sacred vow, yet leave himself a secret exit, and why a merchant's contract could be both a promise and a lie. What does it truly mean when you give your word? An oath sworn on a saint's bone was a contract with the divine itself. In a world without mass literacy or sprawling legal codes, these verbal pledges formed the very bedrock of society. They were the glue that held the feudal structure together, binding a knight to his lord, a peasant to his village, and a king to his people. The ceremony was everything. A man would place his hand on a holy relic, a Bible, or even the consecrated host, calling upon God and all his saints to witness his words. To break such an oath was not merely a social faux pas, it was a mortal sin, a direct offense against heaven that could damn one's soul for eternity. This immense spiritual weight gave the oath its power, but that power was a double-edged sword. Because the consequences of breaking faith were so severe, the language of the oath itself became a meticulous craft. Every word was chosen with immense care, often embedding subtle conditionals and clever ambiguities. A vassal might swear to provide 40 days of military service each year to his lord, but the exact start date or the definition of a valid summons could be left conveniently vague. A king might pledge to uphold the laws of the realm, but which laws, and as interpreted by whom? This was the genius and the treachery of the medieval oath. It presented an unbreakable bond to the public eye, while secretly sewing within its own fabric the very threads that could one day unravel it. The performance was one of absolute fealty, but the small print, whispered between the lines, was a map for a future retreat. So how did they actually construct these linguistic trapdoors? The answer lies in the specific and often deceptive tools of their trade. These linguistic trapdoors were the secret weapons of medieval promise-making. At its core, a trapdoor was a deliberately ambiguous phrase, a vague term, or a conditional clause woven directly into the fabric of an oath. It was a hidden escape hatch, built into the very structure of a promise, designed to be invoked later to nullify or alter the agreement's original intent. While we might compare them to modern legal loopholes, their function was uniquely medieval. Today's loopholes often exist in a sea of written regulations and precedent. In the Middle Ages, however, the spoken word held immense power, and written documents were rare, precious, and often contested. This clash between oral tradition and the emerging authority of the written word created the perfect environment for these trapdoors to flourish. Why were they so necessary? In a society with limited literacy and legal systems that were still evolving, absolute clarity was often impossible and sometimes strategically undesirable. A lord might not want his vassals to know the exact limits of their obligations. A king might need to appease his barons with a public vow, while privately reserving his right to interpret that vow as he saw fit. Language itself became a battlefield for control. The real power lay not just in making the promise, but in holding the exclusive key to its interpretation. For instance, a vassal could swear to serve his lord in all just wars. That single word, just, was a masterclass in ambiguity. Who decided what constituted a just war? The lord, the vassal, the church. That tiny, seemingly virtuous adjective was a loaded weapon, waiting for the right moment to be fired. It transformed a straightforward pledge into a negotiable statement, a promise with a built-in argument. This was the subtle art of medieval power politics, fought not with swords in a field, but with carefully chosen words in a ceremony. That single word, just, reveals the true engine of feudal power. Ambiguity was never an accident in these agreements. It was a meticulously crafted tool, designed to look like a promise while functioning as a lever for control. Terms like customary duties or reasonable aid were not just vague, they were elastic. They could stretch to fit a lord's immediate need, whether that meant demanding an extra week of labor from his peasants or calling for a new tax to fund a castle repair. The power to define what was customary or reasonable almost always rested with the lord himself. This created a system where the letter of the agreement was technically upheld, even as its spirit was shattered. Consider a knight's pledge of 40 days of military service. The contract might be silent on crucial details. Did those 40 days include the lengthy and dangerous travel time to the battlefield? If the campaign stretched beyond 40 days, was the knight obligated to stay, and if so, at whose expense? A clever lord could manipulate these unspoken conditions, effectively extracting 60 days of service from a 40-day pledge. The same logic applied to taxes and labor. A peasant owing a certain number of days working his lord's fields might find the definition of a day's work suddenly changed, the sun setting later in his lord's estimation than in his own. This strategic vagueness bred a constant, low-grade tension that defined medieval life. It was a cold war of interpretation waged in manor courts and great halls where the powerful held the only dictionary. This system of manipulated meanings, however, demanded a physical form to make it real and enforceable. That form was the written charter, a document that looked like clarity but often contained traps of its own. The Oaths of Strasbourg, sworn in the year 842, reveal this linguistic warfare in stunning detail. Two brothers, Charles the Bald and Louis the German, formed an alliance against a third, their brother Lothair. Their pledge of mutual support was a masterstroke of political theater, but its true genius was buried in the very words they spoke. The oaths were recorded not in formal Latin, the language of law and the church, but in the two vernacular tongues of their respective armies, an early form of French for Charles's followers and an early German for Louis's men. This was not merely a gesture of inclusivity, it was the deliberate construction of a massive interpretive trapdoor. By speaking directly to their followers in their own languages, each brother could subtly shape the promise to suit his own needs, presenting a unified front while preserving his own freedom of action. The specific phrasing was a labyrinth of conditional loyalty. Each king swore to come to his brother's aid, but the oath was carefully framed as a defense against their common enemy, Lothair. The moment that threat changed or dissolved, the entire foundation of the oath could be legally re-evaluated. What sounded like an unbreakable pact to a soldier listening in Old French might have carried a slightly different nuance to a warrior hearing it in Old High German. The word for help or justice or even enemy could have shades of meaning known only to the native speaker. This multilingual strategy allowed Charles and Louis to build a powerful coalition, a united army bound by a public vow, while each man held a private key to its meaning. They forged an alliance in plain sight, yet the real agreement existed in the shadowy space between two different sets of words. It was a diplomatic triumph built on a foundation of brilliantly engineered ambiguity. But what happened when these verbal promises were finally committed to parchment, transforming spoken air into written law? Even the authority of God could be bent by a carefully placed word. When a person swore an oath on a holy relic or the Bible, they were entering into a contract with heaven itself, a pact that placed their immortal soul on the line. The fear of eternal damnation was the ultimate enforcement mechanism, Yet this very sanctity became a tool for manipulation. Cunning individuals learned to weave conditional phrases directly into their most solemn vows. A knight might pledge his loyalty, saying, "So help me God, provided that my lord continues to honor my rights to these lands." That small clause, provided that, acted as a hidden fuse. If the lord failed to meet his unspoken end of the bargain, the vassal could argue before an ecclesiastical court that the oath was now void, released from divine sanction through no fault of his own. The oath remained sacred, but its conditions had been cleverly designed to fail. This practice infuriated kings and popes, who saw the absolute power of oaths being eroded by legalistic trickery. Church courts became arenas for this high-stakes wordplay, where learned clerics pored over the precise phrasing of vows, searching for any justification to absolve a person from their promise. One of the most common arguments was that of duress. A baron forced to swear fealty at sword point could later petition the church, claiming his vow was made under mortal fear and was therefore not binding in the eyes of God. The churchman would then debate whether the threat was sufficient to invalidate the oath, engaging in complex interpretations of canonical law. This created a bizarre reality where the more sacred and absolute an oath appeared, the more incentive there was to lace it with secret trapdoors, turning a promise to God into a temporary and conditional arrangement. So, if divine sanction could be cleverly circumvented with words, what hope was there for a simple, honest agreement between two merchants? The scribe's quill was the ultimate weapon in this war of words. In a world where few could read or write, these men held immense, almost magical power. They were the architects of the written record, the ones who translated the messy, spoken agreements of the feudal world into the crisp, authoritative lines of Latin on parchment. But their loyalty was rarely to the truth of the agreement. It was to the patron who paid their fee, the lord or bishop or wealthy merchant who commissioned the document. This relationship turned every contract and charter into a potential battlefield, drafted not for clarity but for advantage. The scribe's craft was in the subtle selection of words. Latin, with its complex grammar and vast vocabulary, was a playground for ambiguity. A scribe could choose between two words for a simple concept like gift. One term, donatio, implied a permanent, irrevocable transfer. Another, concessio, suggested a temporary grant that could be revoked by the grantor. The choice was everything, a hidden directive buried in plain sight. The physical layout of the document was another tool. A crucial, limiting clause could be written in a dense, convoluted sentence, tucked away between more straightforward paragraphs, its importance deliberately downplayed. Or a favorable clause for the patron could be written with slightly larger, more ornate letters, making it stand out to any reader, subtly influencing their interpretation. The scribe's own allegiances played a role, too. A scribe in the employ of a local monastery might draft a land agreement that generously favored the church's claim to a water source. Using technical ecclesiastical terms the peasant on the other side of the bargain could not possibly understand. The document, once sealed and witnessed, appeared to be a simple record of a deal. In reality, it was a loaded weapon, its trigger hidden in a subordinate clause, waiting to be pulled years later in a court of law. This is why written records, which were supposed to be the final word, so often became the first word in a new, bitter conflict. They created not certainty, but a new layer of interpretable reality, one that always favored the party who could afford the better scribe. So, if the written word was so malleable, how could anyone ever be sure of what they truly owned? A peasant's memory was no match for a lord's parchment. For centuries, the true law of the land had lived not in written codes, but in the collective memory of the community. It was an oral tradition passed down through generations, a fluid understanding of customary rights and duties. A villager knew he owed 3 days of labor each spring to repair the mill, not because it was written down, but because his father and his grandfather had always done so. This was a system built on precedent and collective witness, but this fluid, living memory was about to collide with the rigid authority of the written word. As literacy slowly spread among the elite, a new weapon emerged: the written contract. To the common person, a document seemed like the ultimate form of clarity, a permanent record that would end all disputes. In reality, it became the perfect tool for erasing the past. A lord could summon his tenants and have a scribe draft a charter that formally recorded their obligations. The document, however, rarely captured the nuanced give and take of the old oral agreements. It might list the 3 days of labor, but it would conveniently omit the village's traditional right to the lord's timber for repairs, or the feast he was expected to provide on the final day. The written record, sealed and witnessed, now became the only legal reality. The living memory of the community, the oral truth they all knew, was suddenly rendered legally invisible. This created a deep and bitter social conflict. A farmer might find himself in a manor court, accused of failing to provide a cart for the harvest. He would argue that his family had never provided a cart, only a hand cart for local use, a distinction everyone in the village understood. But the Lord's steward would produce the written rental agreement, pointing to a single, unqualified line: the tenant shall provide cartage when required. The farmer's oral tradition, his lived truth, was powerless against the cold, fixed text. The very act of writing something down transformed it, stripping away context and custom, and granting immense power to the person who controlled the quill. Literacy itself became a form of social control, a way to freeze a fluid understanding into a rigid, one-sided fact. The truth of an agreement was no longer what everyone remembered, but what a single piece of parchment declared it to be. That little word, if was the most powerful weapon in a medieval noble's arsenal. Conditional clauses transformed ironclad oaths into negotiable agreements, all through simple phrases like provided that or unless. A vassal might stand before his lord and swear, "I pledge my loyalty, provided my lord acts justly." To the listening crowd, it sounded like a vow of unwavering fealty. But the nobleman and the vassal both knew the truth. The entire promise was now suspended from a single, fragile thread: the definition of the word justly. Who decided what was just? The lord might believe justice meant absolute obedience, while the vassal might interpret it as the lord respecting his traditional rights to a forest or a stream. The oath was no longer a simple promise. It was a loaded argument waiting to happen. This linguistic device allowed powerful men to publicly perform loyalty and submission, maintaining the crucial facade of feudal harmony, while privately reserving a legally justifiable right to rebellion. They could march their knights into battle under their lord's banner, all the while mentally cataloging every perceived slight or unfair demand. Each one became a potential piece of evidence, a justification for the day they might finally declare, "You have not acted justly, and therefore my oath is void." This delicate balance, this constant, low-grade tension between performance and potential defiance, was the very engine of medieval political life. It meant that every lord's court was a simmering pot of conditional loyalties, where a single misstep could shatter an alliance built on a foundation of cleverly chosen words. But how did ordinary people without armies or titles navigate this treacherous landscape of conditional promises? A vassal's promise to provide aid was an open-ended bargain. The word itself, aid, echoed through feudal halls as a term of profound and deliberate ambiguity. In a charter, it might appear as a single, simple obligation. but in practice it was a blank check waiting to be filled in by the Lord. What began as a commitment to occasionally join a military campaign could, with a little creative interpretation, transform into a demand for money to fund a war, a requirement to supply grain for a feast, or even an order to provide laborers to build a new castle gatehouse. The Lord held the exclusive right to define what constituted a valid need for aid, and more importantly, what form that aid should take. This linguistic elasticity created a relationship of perpetual negotiation, where the vassal was never quite sure what his duty would demand of him next. The same strategic vagueness applied to the promise of counsel. A baron swore to give his lord wise counsel, a phrase that sounded like an honor. In reality, it was often a trap. If the king's policies succeeded, the baron received no special credit. But if those policies failed, the king could turn to his council and declare, "You advised me on this course. Your counsel has led to disaster, and now you must share the burden of its cost." The promise of counsel, so noble in theory, became a mechanism for spreading blame and financial liability. It bound the vassal to the lord's fate not through loyalty, but through a shared and inescapable risk. Service was another term stretched to its breaking point. A knight's contract might stipulate 40 days of service per year, but it rarely specified the nature of that service. Was escorting the Lord's tax collector across the county considered military service, or was it mere guard duty? Did supervising the construction of a siege engine count toward the 40 days? By keeping the definition of service broad and undefined, a lord could maximize the utility of his vassals, calling upon them for a dizzying array of tasks while still claiming he was honoring the exact terms of their agreement. The vassal, bound by his oath, had little recourse but to comply, his life perpetually interrupted by demands he could never have fully anticipated. This was the hidden genius of vague terminology. It allowed the powerful to create a system of fluid obligations that could expand to meet any need, binding others in a web of uncertainty while preserving their own absolute freedom of action. The most powerful trapdoor was often the one built from silence. Strategic omission allowed a contract to appear generous and clear, while secretly reserving a vast, undefined space for future demands. A town might receive a royal charter granting it the right to self-governance and hold a market. The townspeople would celebrate, believing their freedoms were secured in writing. Yet the document could remain completely silent on the king's power to levy taxes. This was no administrative oversight. It was a calculated move. Years later, when the town was prosperous, the king could impose a crushing new tax, and when the citizens protested, his lawyers would point to the charter. It did not forbid the king from taxing his own subjects, they would argue. The silence in the document was interpreted as implicit consent, a blank space the crown was always entitled to fill. The same deliberate silence poisoned marriage contracts. A noble family might arrange a union to secure an alliance, drafting a detailed agreement about lands and titles for the male heir. But the document might say nothing about the rights of daughters or a potential widow. This created a devastating ambiguity. If the husband died young, was his wife entitled to any of his estates or merely a small pension? Were her daughters provided for, or could a distant male cousin swoop in and claim everything? The silence left the widow and her children legally exposed, forcing them into costly court battles where the original drafters of the contract held all the advantage. These omissions were weapons of mass dispute. They guaranteed that an agreement was never truly final. A vague clause about customary duties was bad enough, but a total silence on a critical issue was far worse. It created a legal vacuum, and in the Middle Ages, power always rushed in to fill a vacuum. The party who controlled the written record, who held the only copy of the charter, also held the exclusive right to define what that silence meant. So how could anyone ever trust a document when its very gaps were potential weapons? Even the Magna Carta, that great icon of liberty, was engineered with deliberate escape hatches. King John faced a rebellion of his most powerful barons in the year 1215, and the document they forced him to seal was not a clear set of laws, but a masterpiece of negotiated ambiguity. Its most famous clause states that no free man shall be imprisoned or stripped of his rights except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. This sounds like a foundational guarantee of justice, and in time it would become one. But in 1215, the words lawful judgment and peers were brilliantly vague. Who exactly counted as a peer? Was it a jury of one's social equals or a handful of barons hand-picked by the king? What constituted the law of the land? Was it ancient custom, the king's own decrees, or something else entirely? The barons inserted this ambiguity so they could later argue for the most favorable interpretation, one that would shield them from the king's arbitrary justice. They were building a legal shield with a handle only they could hold. The same strategic vagueness applied to feudal payments. The charter specified that an heir inheriting a title would pay a relief, a kind of inheritance tax that was just and lawful. It explicitly forbade the king from demanding more than £100 for a knight's fee, but for the vast baronial estates, the document did not set a fixed amount. It only said the relief should be reasonable. That single word, reasonable, was a trapdoor for both sides. The barons could argue it meant a modest traditional sum. The king could later insist that a reasonable relief for a rebellious baron was a king's ransom. The Magna Carta was not a final settlement. It was a tense ceasefire written in ink that could be read in two different ways. King John himself saw these trapdoors not as limitations but as opportunities. He agreed to the charter under extreme duress, and he immediately wrote to the Pope, arguing that the vows he swore to uphold it were made under coercion and were therefore invalid. He exploited the very same logic of conditional oaths that his barons feared. The Pope, who was John's feudal overlord in some matters, agreed and annulled the charter, plunging England into civil war. The Magna Carta's survival was not due to its clarity, but to its powerful and ambiguous core. Later kings were forced to reissue it again and again, and each time its clauses were reinterpreted and argued over. Its legacy was built not on the rock of certain law, but in the fertile, contested soil of its own vague language. This demonstrated that linguistic trapdoors were not just for kings and lords. Those being ruled could learn to wield them too, turning the master's tools against him. But this raises a final, haunting question. If even the most celebrated agreement in history was built on such shaky linguistic ground, how could anyone ever truly trust the words they heard or the documents they sealed? A marriage contract was a loaded weapon disguised as a family agreement. In the high-stakes game of medieval dynastic politics, these documents were the primary tool for forging alliances, securing borders, and consolidating power. But beneath the formal language of union lay a web of linguistic trapdoors that could disinherit a daughter, bankrupt a rival house, or plunge entire regions into war for generations. The entire future of a noble lineage hinged on the precise definition of just a few critical words. The terms dower and dowry, for instance, sounded straightforward but were fields of legal combat. The dowry was the wealth a bride brought into the marriage, a payment from her family to the grooms. The dower, however, was the portion of the groom's estate guaranteed to support his wife if she outlived him. A cleverly drafted contract could define the dower with crippling specificity, perhaps limiting a future widow to a single, poorly producing manor, leaving her destitute and powerless after her husband's death. This was a cold calculation to ensure the family's main wealth passed cleanly to the next male heir, unburdened by a demanding widow. But the most explosive trapdoor of all was the single word, heir. A contract might promise lands and titles to the heirs of the marriage. To the families shaking hands at the wedding, this clearly meant a son. But if no son was born, the legal interpretation of heirs could suddenly expand to include distant male cousins, or even revert back to the bride's original family. This single, undefined term could void years of political planning in an instant. The failure to produce a male heir was not just a personal tragedy. It was a geopolitical event that activated hidden clauses no one had paid attention to at the celebratory feast. We see this in the notorious case of the Duchy of Brittany. A marriage contract was meant to bind the duchy to a French crown prince. The document was filled with promises and guarantees, but it contained a subtle, almost invisible clause regarding the mental capacity of the ruling duchess. Years later, when the political winds shifted, French lawyers would argue that the duchess had not been of sound mind when she agreed to the union, that the stress of her position had clouded her judgment. They used this manufactured ambiguity to challenge the entire legitimacy of the contract and the independence of Brittany itself. The fate of an entire duchy, its people and its armies, swung on a retrospective argument about a single person's state of mind during a signing ceremony. These contracts reveal that family law was the ultimate battlefield. The quarrels of kings and the destinies of kingdoms were often decided not on a field of battle, but in the quiet, ink-stained words of a marriage agreement, where a misplaced comma or an undefined term could alter the map of Europe for 100 years. The chaos of a medieval marketplace demanded a new kind of promise. In the bustling ports and trade fairs, where goods and currencies from a dozen lands changed hands, the old feudal oaths of loyalty were useless. A merchant needed a contract that could survive a shipwreck, a price collapse, or a bandit attack. Out of this necessity, merchant guilds forged a revolutionary legal language, one that was paradoxically built on a foundation of elegant trapdoors designed for mutual survival. They codified escape clauses not as treachery but as essential risk management. The most famous of these was the Act of God clause. This single phrase could void an entire shipping contract if a storm sank a vessel or a sudden plague closed a city's gates. It was a formal recognition that some forces were beyond human control, and that holding a merchant accountable for a tempest was both cruel and bad for business. It protected the trader from ruin due to pure misfortune, but this necessary flexibility also created a new arena for argument. What exactly constituted an act of God? Was a predictable seasonal storm an act of God, or was it a foreseeable risk the captain should have prepared for? If a shipment of wool was stolen by common bandits, was that an act of God, or was it a failure of the merchant's security, a human failing? The clause that was meant to prevent disputes could itself become the very source of endless litigation, as each side hired learned men to argue the precise boundaries of divine intervention. The same strategic ambiguity applied to pricing. Contracts often stipulated goods would be sold at the prevailing market price. This sounded fair, but the market price was a fluid, elusive thing. Did it mean the price on the day the contract was signed, the day the goods arrived, or an average over the trading season? A merchant could watch prices plummet as his ship sailed into harbor, and then invoke the market price clause to demand a renegotiation, arguing the original agreement was based on a reality that no longer existed. This was not always bad faith. Sometimes it was the only way to avoid total loss, but it meant that no deal was ever truly final until the last coin was counted. This constant, low-grade uncertainty forced the guilds to develop their own courts and their own common law, the law merchant. They needed a faster, more expert system than the slow, formal royal courts to untangle these contractual knots. Judges were often merchants themselves, men who understood the customs of the trade. They had to decide whether a debtor truly could not pay or was simply hiding his assets, whether a quality complaint was legitimate or a buyer's remorse. In doing so, they began to build a body of precedent, slowly trying to close the very loopholes their own language had created. They were trapped in a cycle of their own making, inventing ever more precise language to patch the gaps in their previous inventions, a frantic attempt to bring order to the inherent chaos of commerce. A fief was never just a piece of land, it was a benefice. That single word, from the Latin for benefit or favor, transformed a simple property transaction into a web of moral and spiritual obligation. Medieval legal language was saturated with such metaphors, turning contracts into poetry and poetry into legal weapons. To describe loyalty as a bond was not merely a turn of phrase, it was to invoke an almost physical chain, a connection that could be felt, tested, and potentially broken. This symbolic language was the ultimate trapdoor because a metaphor, by its very nature, invites multiple interpretations. A vassal swore to hold his land from his lord. Did that word hold mean simple legal tenure, like a tenant renting a field? Or did it imply something deeper, a protective, almost sacred stewardship, as if the land itself was a trust placed in his hands by God and Lord? The entire feudal relationship balanced on the interpretation of that single, common verb. When a lord granted a benefice, he was performing an act of generosity. This framing was a brilliant piece of psychological and legal engineering. It meant the land was not a right the vassal had earned, but a gift he had received. A gift, by its nature, could be conditional upon good behavior. It could be taken back if the lord decided the vassal was ungrateful or disloyal. The metaphor of the gift allowed the harsh reality of raw power to be dressed in the elegant clothes of mutual favor and grace. The same duality existed with the concept of the bond. A bond could be a source of strength, the tie that holds a society together, but a bond can also chafe. It can be a shackle. A vassal feeling oppressed by his lord's demands could argue the bond of loyalty had been stretched to its breaking point, that it no longer represented a sacred connection but had become a chain of servitude. He could use the lord's own metaphor against him, claiming the very language of their agreement justified his defiance. This symbolic blending of legal, personal, and spiritual duties created a malleable reality. A dispute over a stream's fishing rights was never just about fish. It was about the violation of a bond. A refusal to pay a tax was not merely an economic act, it was a rupture in the web of benefices. This allowed every conflict to be argued on multiple levels at once. A lord's lawyer could focus on the literal text of a charter in a secular court, while the vassal's ecclesiastical advisor could argue the spiritual metaphor of the bond had been broken in a church court. The same set of facts could lead to two entirely different verdicts, all depending on which layer of the metaphorical language the judge decided to prioritize. The law became a hall of mirrors where the reflection of a promise could be more powerful than the promise itself. For the peasant bound to the soil, the word customary was a prison with movable walls. His entire life was governed by agreements spoken aloud each year in the manor court, recorded in the court rolls with deceptively simple terms. He owed his lord a set number of customary works each week and a few extra days of boon work during the plowing or harvest season. These words sounded fixed and ancient, but they were linguistic trapdoors in their most brutal form. Customary works were not a static number carved in stone. They were a tradition, and tradition could be rewritten by the lord who controlled the record. A steward could simply declare that the local custom had always included an extra day of ditch cleaning each month, or that the definition of a day's labor now meant until the last field was finished, not until the sun dipped below the church tower. The peasant, unable to read the court rolls himself and relying on the collective memory of his neighbors, faced an impossible challenge. How could he prove what the true ancient custom was when the only written account was held by the very man who sought to change it? Boon works were even more insidious. The term itself suggested a gift, a voluntary act of goodwill offered in exchange for a feast or a small reward. But over time, that voluntary act hardened into a compulsory demand. The Lord's officials could simply announce that the boon work for the autumn harvest was now 3 days instead of 2, arguing that the larger yield that year required more hands. The language of gift and gratitude was perverted into a mechanism for extracting more unpaid labor. If a peasant dared to protest, the steward would point to the agreement itself. "You pledged your boon works, did you not? This is the work required." The trapdoor was not in the words written down, but in the unspoken power to define what those words meant in practice. The peasant's promise to provide labor was fixed, but the Lord's right to demand it was elastic. This manipulation of memory was the ultimate weapon. When a new generation of peasants came of age, they were told this was the way it had always been. The true ancient custom, the one their grandfathers remembered with fewer days and clearer limits, was slowly erased, replaced by the new normal dictated from the manor house. A peasant's appeal to the memory of his elders was dismissed as the rambling of an old man, while the steward's neat parchment roll was accepted as objective truth. This created a system of quiet, relentless exploitation, where the rules of the game were constantly shifting just enough to keep the peasantry in a state of perpetual obligation. Their lives were a testament to the fact that the most dangerous trapdoors were not always found in grand royal charters, but in the simple, everyday words that governed their survival. Even the Word of God, as spoken by His Church on earth, was a masterpiece of layered meaning. Papal decrees and the oaths of religious orders were not simple commands. They were intricate legal and theological instruments, designed to project absolute authority while secretly preserving a back door for diplomatic retreat. A pope might command a king to embark on a crusade, but his official bull would include a subtle phrase like, "as far as is possible given the circumstances of your realm." This sounded like a reasonable allowance, a nod to the practical challenges of ruling a kingdom. In reality, it was a pre-forged excuse. The king could delay for years, citing internal rebellions or empty treasuries, all while technically remaining in compliance with the papal order. He was obeying as far as was possible, and he alone was the judge of what that meant. This strategic ambiguity allowed the papacy to maintain the public posture of supreme command without forcing a direct confrontation that could shatter Christendom. The same logic applied to vows within religious orders. A monk would swear a vow of poverty, but the order's rule might define personal property with exquisite care. A beautifully illuminated prayer book gifted by a noble family, was that personal property or a tool for divine worship? A comfortable chair in his cell, was that a violation or a necessity for a frail body? The vow itself was ironclad, but its application was a garden of interpretive possibilities, allowing the order to navigate the messy line between spiritual ideals and human needs. Perhaps the most powerful tool was the phrase, "without prejudice to a higher authority." A papal legate could issue a ruling in a dispute between two warring nobles, ending his decree with those words. On the surface, it reinforced the pope's ultimate power, but it also gave the losing noble a glimmer of hope. He could bide his time, gather support, and later appeal directly to Rome, arguing that the legate's decision was flawed and that the higher authority of the Pope himself should now intervene. The Church never truly closed a case. It always left a thread dangling, a way to reopen a negotiation or reverse a decision when the political winds changed. This was not duplicity for its own sake. It was the essential grease for the machinery of medieval Europe. The Church had to manage emperors, kings, and thousands of independent lords, all while upholding a unified spiritual front. Its linguistic trapdoors were the shock absorbers that kept the entire system from rattling itself apart. They allowed Rome to preach eternal truths while practicing the art of the possible, proving that even salvation could come with a set of carefully written terms and conditions. This intellectual evolution began in the quiet of monastic libraries and university halls. The chaotic world of oaths and charters demanded a new kind of order, and a group of scholars known as the Glossators answered the call. Starting in the 11th century, they pored over the rediscovered texts of ancient Roman law, treating them not as historical artifacts, but as a living body of wisdom that could bring reason to their own tangled legal systems. Their method was deceptively simple. They wrote glosses, tiny annotations in the margins of these ancient texts, explaining the meaning of each word and phrase. A single term like obligation or contract might be surrounded by a spiderweb of commentary, dissecting its every possible nuance. The Glossators aimed to clarify, to close the trapdoors of ambiguity that had plagued medieval agreements for centuries. They believed that by restoring the pure, original meaning of Roman law, they could introduce predictability and fairness. Yet, in their quest for clarity, they often created a new layer of complexity. Their detailed commentaries became a new kind of authority, a secondary text that lawyers and judges could now argue over, sometimes creating more disputes than they resolved. One of the most monumental figures in this movement was Gratian. Around the year 1140, he compiled the Decretum, a massive work that attempted to harmonize 1,000 years of contradictory church canons and papal decrees. Before Gratian, canon law was a jungle of conflicting rules. One bishop might cite an ancient decree to support his position, while his opponent would cite another, equally ancient decree that said the exact opposite. Gratian's genius was to apply the Glossators' methods to this spiritual chaos. He laid these contradictory texts side by side and used logical principles to reconcile them, asking questions like which law is more recent, which one deals with the more specific circumstance. His work created a coherent system of canon law, a standardized framework that church courts across Europe could use. This was meant to shut down the arbitrary interpretations that had made ecclesiastical oaths so malleable. But Gratian's system, for all its brilliance, also provided a new toolkit for the clever legal mind. By establishing a hierarchy of laws and principles, it showed lawyers exactly how to argue their case, revealing which interpretations would hold the most weight in a church court. It systematized the very process of finding loopholes. Following in their footsteps, commentators like Accursius in the 13th century took this work even further. He compiled a monumental standard gloss, a definitive collection of the most authoritative interpretations of Roman law. For a time, his gloss was considered the final word, a universal key to unlocking legal texts. But this created a new kind of trapdoor, the trapdoor of authority. A lawyer could now win a case not by arguing the plain meaning of a contract, but by citing the correct line from Accursius' gloss. The focus shifted from the intent of the parties who made the agreement to the scholarly interpretation of a text about the law behind the agreement. This intellectual foundation transformed the legal landscape from a patchwork of local customs into a more unified, though fiercely debated, body of principles. It laid the groundwork for the modern idea that a contract is not just a promise, but a promise that fits within a rational system of rights and duties. The quest for legal certainty had begun, but it was a quest that would forever be shadowed by the human genius for finding a way out. A man's sworn word was only as strong as the memories of those who heard it. In an age before documents were commonplace, the community itself was the living parchment. When a knight pledged his fealty or a merchant sealed a bargain with a handshake, it was the gathered witnesses who became the final arbiters of truth. Their collective recollection was the only contract, a fragile shield against future lies. But this reliance on human memory created a trapdoor far more insidious than any scribe's quill, the ability to reshape the past by influencing those who held it. The truth of an agreement became a matter of consensus, and consensus could be manufactured. A powerful lord, displeased with a vassal service, could quietly gather his most loyal retainers. He might remind them of the oath-taking ceremony, but with a subtle shift in emphasis. Do you not recall, he would suggest that his promise was conditional on my granting him the river tolls, and did I not later grant those very tolls? The Lord's version of events, repeated by his inner circle, would slowly harden into accepted fact, pressuring other witnesses to doubt their own memories or stay silent. This was not always a crude act of coercion. Sometimes it was a simple, relentless social pressure. A peasant challenging his lord in a manor court would have to stand before the steward and a jury of his neighbors, all of whom depended on the lord for their land and livelihoods. When asked to confirm the peasant's version of a verbal agreement, how many would dare to contradict the lord's account? The community's memory in such a setting was rarely a neutral record. It was a currency spent carefully to maintain peace and favor. This made every oath a potential future conflict, its precise wording a ghost that could be summoned in a dozen different forms. Years after a handshake deal, two merchants might find themselves in a bitter dispute. One would insist the price was fixed, the other would swear it was tied to the market rate upon delivery. With no written record, the case would devolve into a contest of credibility, each man parading his own witnesses to testify to their version of the single, vanished moment. When human memory failed so spectacularly, the court sometimes resorted to a more terrifying arbiter, divine judgment. A trial by ordeal or combat was not merely barbaric superstition. It was the logical, terrifying endpoint of a system built on unreliable testimony. If men could not determine the truth, then God would. In a trial by fire, a defendant might be forced to carry a red-hot iron. If his wounds healed cleanly, God had proclaimed his innocence, revealing the true memory of the event that men had corrupted or forgotten. Trial by combat operated on the same brutal principle, that heaven would grant victory to the man whose oath was righteous. These brutal practices were a direct admission of failure, a confession that human memory was too fragile a vessel to hold the truth. They show us that the past itself was a contested territory. An agreement was not a fixed event that happened once, but a story that was told and retold. Each retelling was an opportunity to edit, to emphasize, to omit. The party with more social power, with more influence over the witnesses, held the power to rewrite the story itself, turning a broken promise into a fulfilled obligation, or an act of defiance into a breach of faith. The very past was a trapdoor, waiting to be opened into a new and more convenient reality. And if the past could be remade with words, what did that mean for the sacred texts that guided their entire world? The printing press shattered the old world of hand-copied promises. Suddenly, a single contract could be reproduced 100 times over, each copy identical to the last. This was meant to be the end of the scribe's secret power, the final victory of clarity over crafty ambiguity. A printed legal form, with its standardized blanks for names and dates, promised to eliminate the personalized trapdoors woven by a paid scribe's quill. No longer could a lord's clerk subtly alter a clause in the second copy of a charter, creating two different versions of the same truth. The printed word was fixed, permanent, and democratically available, or so it seemed. But this new technology did not close the loopholes, it simply industrialized them. The very act of standardization created a new kind of ambiguity, one buried in the pre-written text itself. A printed lease form might state the tenant shall pay all customary dues. That phrase was now locked in, unchangeable across every copy. But its meaning was as elastic as ever, and now its interpretation could be enforced on a scale previously unimaginable, binding thousands to the same vague obligation. This was the paradox of the press. It created uniformity without creating understanding. The potential for mass deception grew alongside the potential for mass literacy. With printing came the specter of the perfect forgery. In a scribble culture, a document's authenticity was tied to unique handwriting, specific ink, and the testimony of the scribe. A printed document, however, could be run off a press by anyone with the type and the skill. An unscrupulous merchant could produce a dozen copies of a favorable contract, backdate them, and present them in court as the original agreement. How could a judge tell which copy had been authorized by both parties and which was a clever fake? The very technology that promised to end disputes over the wording of agreements now created furious new battles over their very existence. Unauthorized versions of royal decrees or papal bulls could circulate through towns, each one slightly altered to serve a faction's political ends. People were left to wonder which version of the law was the true one, which command actually came from the king. Printing did not bring a final, stable truth. It simply multiplied the number of competing truths, forcing society to develop new methods of verification, like royal seals on printed proclamations or notary signatures on standardized forms, in a frantic attempt to reimpose order on the chaos it had unleashed. The trapdoor had evolved, moving from the private cunning of a single scribe to the systemic potential for manipulation embedded in the press itself. So, if the printed word could be so easily weaponized, where could anyone turn to find a promise that was truly unbreakable? A ship's cargo manifest written in Arabic might list a price in Venetian ducats, while the accompanying contract was drafted in Greek according to Byzantine law. This was the dizzying reality of trade in the Crusader states, where Latin knights, Armenian merchants, Arab diplomats, and Italian sailors all collided. In this cultural whirlwind, a simple contract was never simple. It was a high-stakes puzzle where a single mistranslated word could sink a fortune. The very concept of a truce, for instance, was a linguistic minefield. To a Latin crusader, a 10-year truce with a Muslim emir was a temporary pause in a holy war, a chance to regroup and rearm. But to the emir, operating within an Arabic diplomatic tradition, the same truce might be seen as a more permanent state of non-aggression, a lasting peace that could be broken only by a grave and direct provocation. This fundamental mismatch in understanding turned every expiration date on a treaty into a potential flashpoint. The crusader would prepare for war as the 10th year ended, while his counterpart viewed such mobilization as a shocking act of bad faith. This created a perpetual cycle of accusation and conflict, all born from a trapdoor of untranslatable cultural concepts. Merchants learned to weaponize these legal gaps. A savvy Genos trader might draw up a contract with an Egyptian partner that was beautifully binding in the commercial courts of Alexandria, where Islamic law prevailed. Yet that same document could be riddled with clauses that were completely unenforceable back in the merchant's home port of Genoa, where a different set of maritime laws applied. He could agree to a penalty for late delivery that was standard under Maliki jurisprudence, knowing full well that a judge in Italy would throw it out as usurious or excessive. This was the ultimate commercial trapdoor, an agreement designed to be solid in one courtroom and porous in another. The power lay in choosing the venue. A dispute over a spoiled shipment of spices would see both parties racing to file suit in the court whose legal tradition most favored their position. The same set of facts could lead to two diametrically opposed rulings, all based on which culture's law was used to interpret the words on the page. These merchants were not just traders, they were early masters of jurisdictional arbitrage, playing entire legal systems against each other for profit. Even the interpreters held immense, dangerous power. A bilingual scribe translating a land grant from Armenian to Latin could subtly shift the meaning of a boundary description. The phrase "as far as the old olive grove" might refer to a specific, gnarled tree in one language, but in translation, it could become the general area where olives once grew, a much vaguer and more expansive territory. This was not necessarily malice. Sometimes it was the inherent difficulty of finding perfect equivalence, but it meant that the true agreement existed not in either version of the text, but in the liminal space between them, a space controlled by the translator. Disputes would erupt years later, with each party brandishing their own language's version of the contract as the definitive truth. They were arguing over two different ghosts of the same promise. In response, the most sophisticated commercial powers began developing a hybrid legal language, the Rolls of Olron, a collection of maritime laws that circulated widely, blended customs from Atlantic and Mediterranean traders into a common framework. It was a desperate, pragmatic attempt to build a bridge over the chasm of legal difference, to create a single set of rules that could govern a transaction from start to finish, no matter whose flag flew on the ship. Yet for every gap these efforts closed, a dozen new ambiguities were born from the next cultural encounter, proving that the quest for a perfect, universal contract was as elusive as the horizon itself. The fear of perjury was a slow-burning terror in the heart of every oath-taker. Beyond the immediate threat of legal penalty or a lord's displeasure, there loomed a far more terrifying prospect: the eternal damnation of one's soul and the complete ruin of one's social standing. This profound dread was not a mere side effect of the system, it was its primary engine, a psychological trapdoor that could be sprung with a single demand. A lord could present a vassal with a deeply unjust contract, confident that the vassal's terror of swearing a false oath would force his hand. The vassal was trapped in a spiritual dilemma, damned if he swore a vow he intended to break, and damned if he refused to swear and faced immediate earthly punishment. His signature was not merely an agreement, it was a confession of fear. This anxiety was carefully cultivated from childhood. Sermons thundered from pulpits about the fate of perjurers, their tongues blackening in their mouths, their souls destined for the lowest circle of hell. In a tightly knit village community, to be known as an oath-breaker was a social death sentence. No one would trade with you, no one would stand as a witness for you, your family might be shunned. Your name would become synonymous with falsehood. This social pressure was as binding as any legal clause, a prison built from the disapproving glances of one's neighbors. Yet, even this ultimate fear had its own escape hatch, carefully managed by the church. A nobleman who found himself bound by a coerced or disastrous oath could seek out his confessor. In the privacy of the confessional, he could plead his case, arguing that the vow was made under duress or that upholding it would lead to a greater sin. A politically astute priest, perhaps one with ties to the nobleman's family, could grant absolution, effectively releasing him from his spiritual bonds. This was the final, paradoxical layer of the system. The very institution that instilled the fear of perjury also held the keys to the prison, offering a divine pardon for a strategically broken promise. The psychological game was complete. You were manipulated into an oath by fear, and you could be released from it by a carefully negotiated forgiveness, proving that the true contract was not just between people, but between the individual and his own terrified conscience. The ghosts of medieval scribes still whisper in our courtrooms today. The legal principles we now take for granted are direct descendants of those ancient struggles with ambiguous words. That old merchant's act of God clause has evolved into the modern legal doctrine of force majeure, a term that still protects parties from unforeseen disasters that make a contract impossible to fulfill. Just as a medieval captain could not be held accountable for a tempest, a modern company might invoke force majeure for a pandemic or a sudden war, arguing these events were beyond its control and thus void its obligations. The same old arguments persist too. Lawyers still battle over what constitutes a true force majeure event, just as their predecessors debated the boundaries of divine intervention. The trapdoor of divine wrath has simply been relabeled with a French legal term. The medieval ideal of a bond of loyalty finds its echo in the modern concept of good faith. Today, many contracts include an implied duty of good faith and fair dealing, a requirement that neither party will sabotage the other's ability to benefit from the agreement. This is the direct heir of the feudal bond, an attempt to enforce the spirit of a deal when the letter of the law falls short. A landlord cannot arbitrarily refuse to renew a lease for a successful tenant, much like a medieval lord was not supposed to demand aid for a purely malicious purpose. Yet the vagueness remains. What exactly does good faith look like in a complex corporate takeover? The definition is as elastic and contested now as the word just was in a knight's oath, ensuring that lawyers will never run out of work. Even the strategic silences of old charters live on in the legal doctrine of implied terms. Courts today will sometimes read terms into a contract that the parties never explicitly wrote down, but which are necessary to make the agreement work as intended. If you hire a builder to construct a house, the law implies that the roof will not leak, even if the contract says nothing about waterproofing. This is the modern answer to the lord who remained silent on taxes, a legal tool used not to create a trapdoor but to close one, ensuring fairness where the written word is silent. Yet this power of implication is itself a double-edged sword. One party's necessary implication is another party's unfair burden, leading to fresh battles over what should have been obvious to everyone involved. This long historical arc teaches us a crucial lesson for our own lives. Whether you are signing a cell phone contract, a rental agreement, or an employment offer, you are stepping into a stream of history that flows directly from those medieval scriptoria. The fine print is not just tedious legalese, it is the modern battlefield where vague terms are defined and power is negotiated. Understanding that words like reasonable, customary, or market rate are not neutral facts but loaded weapons gives you a distinct advantage. It makes you ask the right questions: reasonable according to whom, customary in what context. This historical awareness transforms you from a passive signer into a vigilant participant, someone who knows that the true meaning of a promise is never just in the words themselves, but in the fight over what those words will eventually be made to mean. The romantic image of a knight giving his simple, heartfelt word is a beautiful fiction. Medieval reality was far more intricate and intellectually demanding. Every level of society, from the king in his hall to the peasant in his field, was engaged in a constant, subtle war of interpretation. Their promises were not simple declarations, but intricate constructs, engineered with the same cunning a master mason might use to hide a secret passage within a castle wall. This was not a world of blunt honesty, but one of sophisticated linguistic strategy, where the ability to navigate the traps hidden within a vow was a key survival skill. Think of the chivalric tales of unswerving loyalty. The reality was that a vassal's oath of fealty was often a masterpiece of conditional logic, riddled with invisible clauses that could nullify it under the right, or rather the wrong, circumstances. The ideal of the straightforward, honorable promise persists because it comforts us, but it obscures the vibrant, messy, and brilliant complexity of the medieval mind. They were not less intelligent than we are, they simply fought their battles with different weapons. Their primary arsenal was not the sword and shield, but the carefully chosen word, the strategic silence, and the malleable metaphor. Recognizing this does not make their world seem more treacherous, but more fascinating. It reveals a culture that prized intelligence, foresight, and legal creativity, proving that in the game of power, a well-placed conditional clause could be far more effective than a legion of knights. Here is a translation of a vassal's oath from a 12th century charter. I, Bernard, pledge my faith to Lord Raymond. I will be faithful to you all the days of my life, and I will perform for you the services that I am rightly and customarily bound to perform. At first glance, it appears to be a straightforward promise of loyalty, but every word is a carefully laid stone in a path full of hidden turns. The very first phrase, pledge my faith, seems absolute. Yet in this context, faith did not mean blind obedience. It meant a bond of trust, and a bond implies two parties. Bernard is implicitly saying, my faithfulness is contingent on you holding up your end of this unspoken bargain. The Lord Raymond hears this and understands the conditional nature of the pledge. He knows Bernard's loyalty is not a free gift, but a conditional loan. Then we encounter the most potent trapdoor in the entire text, the promise to perform services that I am rightly and customarily bound to perform. The words rightly and customarily are a masterclass in strategic vagueness. What services are customary? Is it 40 days of military service or 50? Does it include repairing the Lord's fence, or is that an extra demand? The definition of rightful service is even more dangerous. Who decides what is right? Bernard surely believes a rightful service is one that aligns with his family's long-held traditions. Lord Raymond, however, may feel that any service he demands is inherently right by virtue of his position. This single clause plants the seed for every future dispute they will ever have. When Bernard rides to war, he will be mentally tallying whether this campaign fits his definition of a rightful call to arms. When Raymond demands extra labor to build a new mill, Bernard will scrutinize the demand against his memory of his father's obligations. The charter records the oath, but it does not record the two entirely different dictionaries being used by the men who spoke it. This document was not meant to prevent arguments. It was designed to win them. By writing down the agreement with such elegant ambiguity, Lord Raymond ensured that he held the ultimate interpretive key. In any dispute, his version of customary and rightful would carry more weight in his own court. Bernard, by swearing to these vague terms, had boxed himself into a corner, his only defense a fading oral tradition against the growing power of the written record. The parchment itself becomes a silent witness to a profound tension, a public performance of unity that privately acknowledged a relationship of constant, low-grade negotiation. Our journey through these linguistic trapdoors reveals a world where words were not merely spoken, but strategically deployed. Every promise was a potential puzzle, and trust was not a given state but a constant, careful negotiation. We have witnessed how ambiguity, clever conditionality, and deliberate silence allowed kings to appear bound by sacred oaths while secretly holding a key to their own escape. We have seen how lords used vague terms like customary and rightful to stretch the obligations of their vassals, and how merchants crafted clauses to survive the storms of fortune. This history is far more than a fascinating curiosity. It is a stark and revealing mirror held up to our own world. The same principles that governed a feudal oath now operate within the fine print of your software agreement, your employment contract, and your insurance policy. The battle over the definition of reasonable force majeure or industry standard is the direct descendant of those medieval arguments over what constituted a just war or a rightful service. Language remains the primary battlefield where power is asserted, control is maintained, and freedom is negotiated. Let this exploration be a lasting reminder to read not just the words but the spaces between them. To think critically about who holds the power to define the terms of any agreement, and to appreciate the profound, often invisible, power embedded in the language we use every day. If this deep dive into the cunning intellect of the past has intrigued you, we would love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more journeys into the hidden corners of history, where the secrets of yesterday illuminate the complexities of today.